How did 8,000 men do what 500,000 could not? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the central unsolved mystery of the Vietnam War, buried under 50 years of American memoirs, Hollywood films, and a cultural mythology so powerful that most people on Earth believe they already know everything important about that conflict. They do not. Because the most consequential story from Vietnam was not written in Washington or Hanoi or Saigon. It was written in a jungle province the size of a small country, by men who moved in groups of 12 and left no sound behind them, and who accomplished something so remarkable that the military establishment which witnessed it could not bring itself to officially acknowledge what it had seen. The Americans called their methods cowardly. The Vietnamese gave them a name that told the real story, and the tactics themselves were not buried when the war ended. They were quietly folded into the architecture of the most lethal special operations forces on Earth, where they remain today, taught in every elite military school on the planet, under names that carefully omit the country where they were proven and the war in which they saved lives that a different approach would have destroyed. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the first Australian task force before today? Most people outside Australia have absolutely no idea this story exists. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why that is, and why that omission is one of the most revealing facts about how powerful institutions handle truths that make them uncomfortable. Now let us go. To understand what the Australians did in Phuoc Tuy Province, you must first understand the machine they were watching fail around them. The failure was not subtle. It was spectacular, expensive, and conducted in front of the entire world with the confidence of men who had never seriously entertained the possibility of being wrong. The American military in Vietnam was the most technologically advanced fighting force in human history, and it was losing to farmers and jungle fighters, and the reason it was losing was written plainly in its own doctrine for anyone with the honesty and the institutional courage to read it straight. General William Westmoreland arrived in Vietnam carrying a strategic philosophy that had been refined over decades, tested in training exercises across multiple continents, and approved by the brightest minds Fort Bragg and West Point could produce. 3 pillars held the doctrine upright. The first was overwhelming firepower, the absolute conviction that any tactical problem could be solved by applying sufficient explosive force to the correct grid square. The second was helicopter mobility, the ability to insert and extract forces anywhere in the country within hours, giving American commanders what they believed was an insurmountable advantage in speed and flexibility that no light infantry force could match. The third pillar was the most revealing of the 3, because it exposed not just a tactical choice, but a fundamental philosophical confusion at the heart of the American approach. A metric called the body count, which measured success by the number of enemy soldiers killed and which produced, for Congress and the press and the generals writing their briefings, the appearance of progress in a war where genuine, durable progress was remarkably difficult to define. The strategy had a name that sounded efficient and modern and decisive. Search and destroy. Find the enemy, fix his position, and incinerate the surrounding jungle with napalm and heavy artillery and the full weight of the industrial military capacities of the wealthiest nation on Earth. The doctrine had worked against the conventional armies of Korea, fighting along established front lines with defined supply chains and predictable movement patterns, and the generals in Washington were absolutely certain it would crush any resistance that presented itself in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The enemy had already written the counter, and they had written it before the 1st American Combat Battalion touched Vietnamese soil, and it was sitting in their operational planning documents, waiting to be executed the moment American forces committed to their first engagement. Viet Cong commanders had studied the American playbook with the focused attention of people whose survival depended entirely on understanding it completely. They had identified its single catastrophic vulnerability, the thread that, if pulled, would unravel the entire design and expose the force beneath it as something far more fragile than its technology suggested. The American war machine depended on one capacity above all others: the ability to call air support and artillery the moment ground forces made contact with the enemy. That capacity was the foundation on which everything else rested, the assumption built into every tactical decision, the invisible scaffolding that held the entire doctrine upright. Remove it, and the most expensive military apparatus in the history of organized violence became a collection of frightened young men in a jungle they did not understand, stripped of the technological advantage that American doctrine treated as a non-negotiable baseline requirement for survival, rather than a luxury that could be engineered away. The counter-doctrine the Viet Cong developed in response was elegant in its brutality and simple enough to be explained in a single sentence that any soldier could memorize and execute in the chaos of first contact. When the Americans opened fire, Viet Cong soldiers would not retreat. They would charge directly toward the American positions, closing to 20 meters, then 15, then 10, pressing so tightly against the American lines that no pilot circling overhead in his aircraft could release his payload without destroying the very soldiers he had been called to save. At that range, in that proximity, technology became not merely irrelevant, but actively counterproductive. The expensive aircraft, the precision munitions, the artillery batteries pre-registered on likely engagement areas, all of it neutralized by the simple act of closing distance. Numbers decided who survived when the tools of distance warfare could not be used. The Viet Cong had numbers, and they had jungle, and they had 20 years of patience accumulated through a generation of fighting the French and winning. The statistics emerging from the field by 1966 and 1967 told the story the Pentagon was working hard to contain within the limits of optimistic briefing language. Units making contact with enemy forces were taking casualties at rates that defied any logic built on assumptions of technological superiority. Body count numbers climbed steadily upward in the briefing rooms, while the strategic situation on the ground failed to improve by any measurement that could survive honest scrutiny. Provinces were declared pacified in official reports and resumed hostile operations within weeks of the declaration. Entire regions claimed as secured by American commanders became ambush corridors the moment patrol density dropped below the level required to maintain the fiction of control. American commanders responded to each failure with the only tool their doctrine offered: more of what had already failed. More battalions deployed, more airstrikes ordered, more artillery expended, more search and destroy sweeps conducted through jungle that absorbed men and material and helicopter hours without yielding anything that could be honestly described as progress. There is a particular institutional arrogance that interprets the continuous absence of results not as evidence of a flawed approach, but as evidence that the flawed approach requires further intensification, more resources, more commitment, more of exactly the thing that is demonstrably not working. The American military in Vietnam had this quality in abundance, and the cost it extracted was paid not by the generals who wrote the doctrine in air-conditioned offices, but by the 19-year-old soldiers who executed it in jungle that was trying to kill them before the enemy ever got the chance. What makes the failure historically inexcusable, what elevates it from tragedy to something with a sharper moral edge, is that the warning was explicit, documented, and delivered by the Americans themselves before the major escalation committed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to a campaign built on acknowledged ignorance. In May of 1962, at an ANZUS meeting in Canberra, United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk sat across from his Australian and New Zealand counterparts and made an admission that should have fundamentally rewritten the strategic calculus of the coming war before the war properly began. He told them, directly and without qualification, that the United States Armed Forces knew little about jungle warfare. He said this in 1962, 3 years before the major escalation. 3 years before the commitment of 500,000 American soldiers to a jungle campaign that would define a generation and consume 58,000 American lives. The admission was recorded. The knowledge of the deficiency was documented in meeting minutes that were filed and retained. The escalation happened anyway, driven by political imperatives and Cold War pressures, and the institutional momentum of a military establishment that had decided what kind of war it was going to fight before it arrived in the country where the fighting would occur. Into this accumulating catastrophe, a different kind of army was watching and thinking and preparing to demonstrate what could be accomplished when institutional humility replaced institutional arrogance, and when doctrine was built from the ground up through experience rather than imposed from the top down through assumption. The jungle where Australia learned to fight was not in Vietnam. It was not even on the Asian mainland. It was in the dense, suffocating, perpetually humid forests of the Malay Peninsula, in a war that most of the world has largely forgotten, but which shaped the military philosophy of every Australian soldier who ever walked into Phuoc Tuy Province more profoundly than any training manual or peacetime exercise could have accomplished, because the lessons were paid for in the only currency that produces genuine military knowledge. The Malayan Emergency began on the 17th of June, 1948, when the Malayan Communist Party launched a sustained guerrilla campaign from concealed jungle bases against British colonial authority across the length and breadth of the peninsula. The conflict would consume 12 years, claim thousands of lives on both sides, and reshape Commonwealth military thinking about counterinsurgency more profoundly than any conflict since the Second World War. The MNLA, the military arm of the insurgency, never fielded more than 8,000 fighters at any single moment. Against this relatively small force, the British initially deployed the response that conventional military training produces automatically and almost inevitably. Area sweeps covering large tracts of jungle with battalion-sized formations, mass detentions of suspected sympathizers, punitive operations designed to demonstrate the costs of supporting the insurgency, and the overwhelming conventional force that had proved decisive against Japan a few years earlier. It failed entirely and comprehensively, and at considerable cost. The jungle absorbed British patrols the way water absorbs ink, leaving no trace and yielding no result. Insurgents melted into the canopy at the sound of approaching formations and reappeared 50 kilometers away, untouched and untracked, and as capable as they had been before the sweep consumed weeks of operational effort. Casualties mounted on the government side, while the enemy remained elusive, and the civilian population, subjected to the disruption and occasional brutality of large-scale operations, grew more hostile to the very forces claiming to operate in its interests. The man who reversed all of this arrived in 1950 carrying a quality that made him genuinely dangerous to the comfortable assumptions of his own side: a willingness to say, plainly and publicly, and with the weight of genuine battlefield experience behind him, that the current approach was fundamentally wrong and needed to be replaced with something that had actually been tested against the problem it was supposed to solve. General Harold Briggs had served in Burma during the Second World War, and in Burma he had witnessed at close range what dense jungle does to armies that approach it as a conventional battlefield and expect it to behave accordingly. Before issuing a single operational order upon his arrival in Malaya, Briggs spent an entire month traveling the length of the peninsula, sitting down with officers and constables and civil administrators at every level of the response structure, building a picture of the actual situation from the ground up, rather than accepting the picture that headquarters preferred to present. What he produced at the end of that month was not a revised version of the existing battle plan with adjusted objectives and reallocated resources. It was a fundamental reconceptualization of what military force was for and how it achieved political objectives in an environment where the enemy had deep roots in the local population and the local terrain. The role of the armed forces, Briggs concluded, was not to destroy the insurgency through the progressive application of superior firepower. It was to separate the insurgents from the population they fed on for food and intelligence, and recruits and political legitimacy, to methodically starve them of every resource that sustained their campaign across its multiple dimensions, and to transform the jungle itself from the insurgents' greatest and most reliable asset into an environment where the patient skill of small, well-trained patrols consistently defeated the reactive mass of large conventional formations. He reportedly warned his reluctant brigadiers, men who had earned their positions through distinction in conventional warfare, that they were not going to like what he was about to tell them. He was right, and he told them anyway, because the alternative was losing. The document that codified his approach in permanent, teachable, transferable form was completed in 1952 and given the deliberately unremarkable title of Anti-Terrorist Operations in Malaya. The acronym was ATOM, and buried within its pages was a sentence that contained everything that the American military would need to know about Vietnam and would subsequently decline to absorb until after losing the war had made the lesson too expensive to continue ignoring. In a low-intensity war, the document stated with the precision of a conclusion earned through testing rather than arrived at through theorizing, individual soldiers' skill and endurance are of far greater importance than overwhelming firepower. This was not theoretical by 1952. It was a tested operational conclusion drawn from 4 years of jungle fighting against a determined and experienced enemy in conditions that bore a striking and uncomfortable physical resemblance to the terrain of Southeast Asia. The British had found the answer to the problem they were facing. They had written it down with precision and clarity. They had taught it systematically at a dedicated jungle warfare school that processed thousands of soldiers through its curriculum and measured the results in operational outcomes, and the curriculum produced results that the previous approach had been incapable of generating. The Malayan Emergency ended in 1960 with the MNLA militarily neutralized, the population gradually shifting its allegiance away from the insurgency, and the political conditions for Malaysian independence being constructed on a foundation of genuine rather than claimed security. Australia had been present for all of it, absorbing every lesson with the focused attention of people who understood that the lessons would be needed again. An Australian infantry battalion committed to the emergency in 1955 and fought alongside British units for 8 years in terrain that veterans of both campaigns would describe, when they stood in the Vietnamese jungle a decade later, as disturbingly familiar in its character and its demands. Dense canopy that blocked the sun and reduced the jungle floor to a perpetual green twilight in which distances were compressed and directions became unreliable. Humidity so complete and so unrelenting that clothing never fully dried between patrols and equipment corroded on a timeline measured in weeks rather than months. An enemy who possessed an intimate, generational relationship with the environment and who exploited that relationship to appear without warning from positions that should have been empty and vanish with equal speed into terrain that revealed nothing to the unfamiliar eye. The absolute requirement, learned at genuine cost before it was accepted as doctrine, for patience and silence and individual skill over firepower and mass formation movement, and the comfortable assumption that superior technology translated automatically into superior outcomes. These were not lessons absorbed through classroom instruction or absorbed from a training pamphlet read in preparation for deployment. They were paid for slowly and permanently in the specific currency of blood and exhaustion and months of careful, deliberate movement through some of the most physically demanding terrain on Earth, and they produced the kind of institutional knowledge that cannot be acquired any other way. By the time the Malayan Emergency ended, the Australian Army carried in its collective memory something that no equipment procurement budget could purchase and no strategic planning exercise could replicate. It carried a tested, proven, deeply understood methodology for fighting and winning a jungle insurgency. And alongside that methodology, it carried a bone-level comprehension of the specific reasons why the methodology worked, which is a different and more valuable thing than the methodology alone, because it allows adaptation when circumstances change. The officer who took that accumulated knowledge and systematized it into a formal, replicable, teachable doctrine that could be transmitted to soldiers who had not been present for the experiences that generated it was a graduate of the Royal Military College, Duntroon, class of 1937, whose name was Francis Philip Sarong. General Sir Francis Hassett, one of the most respected senior commanders in Australian military history, assessed Sarong as a quiet, deep thinker, a brilliant tactician, very brave in the field, and a good leader. These qualities led to a specific assignment. In 1955, Sarong took command of the Jungle Warfare Training Center at Canungra in southeastern Queensland and dedicated the following years to the task of transforming the accumulated lessons of Malaya into a coherent, systematic curriculum that could be taught to every Australian soldier who might eventually need it, regardless of whether they had stood in a Malayan jungle and learned the lessons personally. He emphasized individual skill over unit size, arguing from evidence rather than theory that a small patrol of superbly trained and properly equipped soldiers accomplished more in jungle counterinsurgency than a company of conventionally prepared infantry who moved loudly and thought in formations. He emphasized patience over speed, arguing that the patrol that arrived at its objective undetected was worth 10 patrols that arrived quickly and compromised, because the undetected patrol could act, while the compromised patrol could only react. He emphasized silence over communication, fire discipline over volume of fire, and intelligence over assumptions about where the enemy would choose to be. The results were noticed beyond Australia's borders. By 1957, the Burmese government, engaged in selecting a foreign military advisor to oversee the training of its armed forces, assessed competing candidates from America, Israel, and Yugoslavia, and chose Sarong. His expertise had achieved a reputation that transcended the modest scale of the army that had produced him. In August of 1962, carrying the doctrine he had spent 7 years refining and teaching at Canungra, Sarong arrived in South Vietnam leading 30 officers and senior non-commissioned officers formally designated as the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, known to everyone who worked alongside them simply as the team. He assessed the American approach to the conflict within weeks of arrival and recorded his assessment in his private diary with the directness of a man who had no patience for diplomatic evasion when the subject was military competence. General Harkins, the MACV commander, had not grasped the nature of his task. Sarong expressed the hope, in language that reads in retrospect as something between professional concern and genuine despair about what the failure of understanding would cost, that Harkins would grasp it soon, for all their sakes. Harkins did not grasp it. His successor did not grasp it in the ways that mattered operationally. The doctrine did not change in response to Australian analysis, because the Australian analysis challenged assumptions that the American institutional structure wasn't prepared to examine. But the Australians were, in the years that followed that diary entry, preparing to stop attempting to change American minds through argument and to start demonstrating through operational results what their minds had concluded. The negotiation that created the first Australian task force in March of 1966 was, on its surface, a routine conversation between senior officers who shared an alliance and a declared enemy. Lieutenant General John Wilton, representing Australia, and General William Westmoreland, representing American command in Vietnam, produced an arrangement that would shape the next 5 years of the conflict in ways that neither man fully anticipated at the time of the agreement. The Australian force, designated 1ATF, would operate under United States 2nd Field Force Vietnam at corps level, reporting to a corps headquarters rather than to any individual American division. In a war defined by the constraints of hierarchical command, where subordination to a division headquarters meant subordination to divisional doctrine, divisional priorities, and the divisional commander's interpretation of what constituted appropriate military behavior. This distinction was not administrative. It was the difference between the Australians being permitted to apply what they knew and being absorbed into a system that would require them to unlearn it. Westmoreland's operational directive to Brigadier David Jackson, the officer selected to command the task force, has become one of the more remarkable documents in Australian military history for what it does not contain. 4 words. Take over Phuoc Tuy. No specific objectives articulated beyond the general requirement to establish dominance over the province. No tactical guidance specifying how that dominance should be achieved or what methods were permissible in pursuing it. No doctrinal constraints requiring alignment with the American search and destroy methodology being applied elsewhere in the country. Jackson was handed a province, a brigade, and 4 words, and then left to interpret them according to the doctrine that Australian soldiers had been building and refining and testing since 1948. He interpreted them exactly as Serong and Canungra and Malaya had prepared him to. Phuoc Tuy Province had not been assigned to Australia by American command, making a determination about where Australian forces could be most usefully deployed. It had been requested by the Australians themselves, chosen with the deliberate attention to geographic advantage of people who understood that the choice of battleground is itself a form of tactical decision. The province sat at the southernmost edge of 3rd Corps, positioned away from the Cambodian border that complicated operations in the western provinces, with the perpetual risk of international incidents whenever pursuit of enemy forces crossed national boundaries. Vung Tau, on the province's southern coast, provided reliable sea access for resupply operations and, in scenarios requiring it, for evacuation. The terrain was demanding and diverse. Jungle in the north and west, dense enough to challenge even the most experienced patrol. Rubber plantations across the central lowlands, where visibility extended to the width between the rows of trees. Mountain ranges anchoring the eastern edge that had never been successfully penetrated by any Allied force. This terrain was not unfamiliar to soldiers who had trained in Queensland and served in Malaya and fought in Borneo. It was the kind of environment the Australian approach had been specifically designed and repeatedly tested to master. And the level of enemy activity in the province was high enough that the doctrine would face genuine pressure rather than the false reassurance of success against an opponent who was not genuinely trying. The enemy that waited inside that terrain had been operating with complete impunity for years, conducting operations across the province without serious interference from any force willing to challenge them on their own ground and on their own terms. The 274th Viet Cong Regiment controlled the Hot Dick Secret Zone in the northwest. 3 battalions of approximately 2,000 experienced soldiers commanding a jungle sanctuary so dense that American reconnaissance aircraft photographed nothing but an unbroken green canopy beneath their flight paths, giving no indication of the forces and the infrastructure that the canopy concealed. The 275th Regiment occupied the Mae Tao Mountains in the east. 3 more battalions and 1,850 more fighters operating from terrain so rugged and remote that no Allied force had successfully penetrated it since the conflict began, and woven through the entire province, connected to every village and every population center by the bonds of birth and shared history, was the D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion. 350 fighters who had grown up within the province's boundaries, who knew every trail and every seasonal watercourse and every reliable hiding place, and who enjoyed the active support or the terrified compliance of a civilian population that had been living alongside their presence for years before the Australians arrived. Brigadier Jackson positioned the task force base at Nui Dat, a rubber plantation 8 kilometers north of the provincial capital of Malaya, and placed it in a way that announced, to anyone who understood the geography of counterinsurgency, exactly what kind of campaign he intended to conduct and what theory of military action he was operating from. He placed his headquarters not at the comfortable edge of secured territory, not near the coast where resupply was straightforward and the threat was manageable, but in the center of the province, between the main communist strongholds and the population centers they were seeking to influence and control. He cleared all inhabitants within 4,000 meters of the base and declared the surrounding area a free-fire zone, denying the enemy the observation of the base and the accurate assessment of patrol departure patterns that would have allowed them to interdict operations before they reached the jungle. From Nui Dat, patrols would spread outward across the province like a slow-moving tide, covering the ground between the base and the enemy's deepest sanctuaries, making the province as a whole into contested territory, rather than maintaining the fiction of security in a narrow corridor while leaving vast areas as unchallenged enemy operating space. The Americans watched the establishment of one ATF with polite and somewhat puzzled skepticism. What the Australians were about to demonstrate would take years to fully register, and longer still to honestly acknowledge. The preparation for a patrol in Phuoc Tuy Province began not at the weapons rack or the ammunition point, but at a precise, technical examination of every way a human being announces his presence to a jungle environment that is constantly listening, and a systematic, methodical elimination of each signal in turn. Sound was the first and most addressable vulnerability, and the Australians addressed it with a thoroughness that seemed, to observers trained in conventional military preparation, to border on the obsessive and impractical. Standard military equipment in the 1960s was engineered for durability and functionality in conventional military environments. It had never been engineered for silence in dense jungle, because the armies that procured it had not imagined that silence would be a primary survival requirement. Metal buckles connected webbing straps and scraped against rifle receivers during movement, with a sound that carried in still jungle air with remarkable clarity. Standard-issue water canteens were rigid metal vessels in which water moved audibly with every step, and the metal cap bounced against the body of the canteen in a rhythm that announced a soldier's pace to anyone familiar enough with the jungle to listen for it. Identity discs hung from the neck on ball-chain lanyards and swung against each other and against the chest with every stride. Small sounds, individually but collectively part of a noise signature, that distinguished a moving soldier from every other thing that moved in a Vietnamese jungle. The load-bearing vest, the ammunition pouches, the pack frame, the rifle sling, all of it created contact points between components that generated, in aggregate, a continuous low-level announcement of presence, audible to a trained ear at distances that made tactical surprise impossible before it could be achieved. The Australians eliminated every source of unnatural sound with a focused, systematic attention that treated each one not as a minor inconvenience to be tolerated, but as a potentially lethal vulnerability to be engineered out of existence. Metal buckles were replaced with paracord ties and fabric fasteners that produced no metallic sound under any movement condition. Identity discs were taped flat and immovable against the skin. Water was carried in soft plastic bladders that compressed silently with every movement and generated none of the sloshing or percussion that metal containers produced. Every piece of equipment was examined specifically for its acoustic signature under movement conditions in vegetation, and anything that could not be silenced was left behind, regardless of the theoretical tactical value it might provide, because theoretical tactical value at the planning stage is worth nothing to a soldier who has been located and targeted by the sound of his own equipment. The boots worn by Australian soldiers patrolling in Phuoc Tuy Province were, to any observer encountering them for the first time, evidence of either remarkable negligence in equipment maintenance or deliberate destruction of government property. Standard-issue jungle boots were designed on the waterproof principle, a design philosophy that made immediate intuitive sense in an environment characterized by monsoon rainfall and permanently saturated ground conditions. The design failed in operational practice for a reason that should have been identified in planning, but apparently was not. In the specific conditions of Phuoc Tuy Province, with its rivers and streams and rice paddies and jungle floor that rarely achieved anything approaching dryness between successive rain events, feet were going to get wet on any patrol of meaningful duration. Waterproof boots did not prevent this. They simply ensured that water, once it had entered over the top of the boot during a stream crossing or a period of movement through standing water, had no pathway to exit. It pooled against the skin of the foot and remained there, creating conditions for trench foot that could render a soldier unable to walk within days of sustained exposure, which in the context of operations that lasted a week or more meant removing the soldier from the patrol and potentially the campaign. The Australian solution was to take a knife to the boot and cut deliberate drainage slits into the lower sides, creating openings through which water drained out with every step rather than accumulating against the skin. The boots looked ruined to anyone expecting standard military appearance standards. They kept soldiers operational for weeks at a time in conditions that would have crippled men wearing unmodified footwear, and a soldier who can keep walking is worth infinitely more than a soldier who cannot. Movement through the jungle was conducted at a pace that American officers, observing it in practice for the first time, found almost incomprehensible in its slowness and almost inconceivable in its apparent operational inefficiency. A patrol advanced 200 meters through vegetation, placing each footfall with deliberate attention to the sound it produced, and then stopped. Not briefly, not for a cursory check of the immediate surroundings before continuing. Stopped for 30 to 60 minutes of genuine, absolute stillness, in which every member of the patrol became part of the environment, and listened with the full, undivided attention of men who understood that their lives depended entirely on what they could hear. The Special Air Service, operating on deep reconnaissance missions in territory where the enemy outnumbered them by factors that made any sustained engagement potentially catastrophic, might cover 3 kilometers in an entire day of operations. Evaluated by the standards of conventional infantry doctrine, this was a rate of advance that would have been considered an embarrassment in any training scenario. Evaluated by the only standard that actually mattered in this environment, whether the patrol arrived at its objective undetected and capable of action, it was precisely correct. The patrol that moves slowly enough to hear the enemy before being heard takes the initiative in every contact and survives. The patrol that sacrifices silence for the comfort of visible daily progress announces itself to an enemy who has been listening since before the patrol left its base. The consequences of this approach across thousands of engagements over 5 years were documented with the rigor of applied operational research in the Cambridge University Press study published in 2015, and the numbers the research produced were not ambiguous in their meaning or their implications. In approximately 80% of all combat contacts in Phuoc Tuy Province, Australian patrols achieved the first burst of fire on the enemy. Not in carefully selected favorable circumstances, not in terrain chosen to advantage the patrol, not in situations where the enemy had been identified in advance and the patrol had time to prepare, but across thousands of engagements in every variety of jungle environment and every kind of tactical situation that 5 years of continuous operations could produce. 80%. And when an Australian patrol achieved that first burst, what followed was consistent enough in its outcome to function as a military law rather than a statistical tendency. They inflicted 10 times the casualties they suffered. 10 enemy soldiers fell for every Australian. Every hour of noise discipline training, every day of patient movement practice, every night of developing the specific capacity to listen to a jungle and identify what did not belong to it, all of it converted directly and measurably into that 80% rate of initiative and that 10-to-1 outcome in combat. The patience was not a philosophical preference or a cultural characteristic. It was arithmetic with consequences measured in human survival. The ambush was the tactical form in which that arithmetic achieved its most concentrated and most decisive expression. More than a third of all ITF contacts were not reactive engagements triggered by unexpected encounters, but deliberate ambushes that the Australians had designed, prepared, and waited in for hours before the enemy arrived. Killing grounds selected for geographic advantages that compressed the enemy's movement options and maximized the effectiveness of the weapons the patrol carried. Claymore mines positioned in overlapping arcs, calculated by men who understood the geometry of the kill zone. Trip flares emplaced at the outer perimeter to provide warning of approach from directions not covered by the primary fields of fire. Fire lanes cleared of vegetation that might absorb or deflect rounds before they reached their intended targets. Patrols settled into those positions and remained in them in absolute silence for hours, or longer if the intelligence required it, until the enemy arrived at the time and the place the patrol had anticipated. The Viet Cong had built their military reputation on exactly this technique through 2 decades of fighting French colonial forces and South Vietnamese regulars, and they were skilled and experienced practitioners of it. The data from Phuoc Tuy demonstrates, without qualification, that the Australians were better. The strategic dimension of the 1ATF campaign was the element that most completely separated the Australian approach from the American doctrine being applied everywhere else in Vietnam. And it was the element that American commanders found most difficult to recognize as military activity because it did not produce the kind of visible, dramatic, reportable events that the body count metric was designed to capture and communicate. American strategy defined success as killing enemy soldiers in sufficient numbers to exceed the enemy's replacement capacity and collapse his ability to sustain organized resistance. This was an attrition strategy, measurable in bodies, communicable in briefings, and fundamentally incapable of addressing the logistical and political dimensions of an insurgency that drew its strength from the population and the land, rather than from any fixed base or linear supply route that could be targeted and destroyed by the methods that attrition warfare provided. The Australians were attacking something that American doctrine did not categorize as a legitimate military objective at all: They were attacking the food supply, and they were doing it with the same patience and precision they brought to every other dimension of the campaign. An insurgent force of the size that the combined Viet Cong formations in Phuoc Tuy represented required regular, substantial, carefully maintained food stocks to sustain the operational capacity of its several thousand fighters across months and years of continuous operations. Those stocks could not be created from nothing. They had to be grown, collected, transported, stored, and regularly replenished through a logistics network that, however invisible to aerial observation and resistant to conventional interdiction, was real and physical and vulnerable to the specific methods that small, patient, well-trained patrols were designed to employ. 1ATF's patrols were directed at that network with the same systematic focus they brought to every other aspect of operations. Over 5 years in the province, Australian and New Zealand forces captured and destroyed more than 1,800 individual bunker systems and base camps. The food discovered in each one was eliminated. The quantity recovered per location declined measurably every year, as the enemy's capacity to build and maintain the network was progressively degraded by the cumulative effect of thousands of small operations. By the second half of 1969, the intelligence assessments being read at 1ATF's headquarters contained something unprecedented in the province's operational record. The enemy's food network was in systemic and accelerating collapse. The Viet Cong responded to what was happening to them in Phuoc Tuy Province, the way that all military forces eventually respond to an enemy they cannot understand through conventional analysis. They named it. They gave it not one name, but two, because what was being done to them was being accomplished by two different kinds of Australian force that each defied their established expectations in different and equally disturbing ways. Regular infantry battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment, the standard product of the Australian Army's training pipeline, were called Biet Quiche by the Vietnamese Communist forces who encountered them. Commandos. The classification was not honorary and was not given in admiration. It was given out of genuine operational bewilderment by experienced guerrilla fighters who had developed reliable, tested expectations about how conventional infantry behaved in the field. American infantry moved in platoons and companies and battalions, generating the noise signatures and the logistical footprint and the tactical predictability of a large conventional force that had been designed around firepower and the assumption of air support. Australian infantry moved in sections of 10 to 12 men and half platoons of 20, operating with an independence from their higher headquarters and achieving a lethality in contact that the Viet Cong could not reconcile with any category of conventional military behavior they had encountered. The conclusion their commanders reached was that these could not be ordinary soldiers following ordinary infantry doctrine. They had to be specially selected, intensively trained elite commandos operating well beyond the normal boundaries of conventional military practice. They were not. They were the ordinary product of a training system that had absorbed the lessons of Malaya and built those lessons into the baseline curriculum for every soldier who wore an Australian uniform and prepared to deploy. For the Special Air Service Regiment, the classification went further in recognition of something that the Viet Cong found even further beyond their experience. The name that spread through enemy units across Phuoc Tuy and into the neighboring provinces where the SASR also operated was Ma Rong, Phantoms of the Jungle. Given not as a compliment and not in admiration, but because the Viet Cong had no framework within which to account rationally for men who left no detectable tracks, generated no identifiable sound, appeared without warning from positions that reconnaissance had confirmed as empty, struck with a precision that had no precedent in their experience of fighting foreign forces, and disappeared before any response could be organized into something capable of pursuing them. The name acknowledged, in the only terms available to the men giving it, that they were encountering something that their experience of warfare had not prepared them to counter. The statistics that explain the name are the most extraordinary produced by any special operations unit in any documented conflict of the 20th century, and they deserve to be stated without qualification or rhetorical softening. In 6 years of continuous operations in Vietnam, conducting nearly 1,200 patrols into territory where the enemy held every geographic and numerical advantage, where the nearest friendly forces were often many hours away, where discovery by an enemy patrol would produce overwhelming numerical disadvantage in terrain designed specifically for ambush, the Australian and New Zealand Special Air Service Regiment lost 1 man killed in action. 1. Not one patrol that ended in disaster. Not one operation that produced significant casualties. 1 individual soldier killed in direct combat across 1,200 patrols over 6 years. American Special Forces operating in comparable environments across the same period rarely achieved kill ratios exceeding 10 enemy casualties for every 1 American lost, even in their most carefully planned and professionally executed operations. Documented SASR kill ratios in multiple engagements exceed 30 to 1. The regiment was achieving lethality 2 to 3 times greater than its American counterparts operating in the same country in groups of 4 to 6 men, without air support standing by overhead, without artillery pre-registered on likely contact points, without any of the technological redundancy that American doctrine treated as the minimum acceptable foundation for special operations survival. The psychological damage inflicted by the SASR's presence in the province registered in the record in ways that battlefield statistics alone cannot fully convey. Communist military documents from the period and the testimony of Vietnamese veterans who survived the campaign describe the emergence of a specific, named fear among forces assigned to operate in areas known to be covered by Australian patrols. Soldiers from the 274th and 275th Regiments developed conditions that contemporary psychology would classify as combat stress reactions, not from the conventional military threat, which experienced fighters had absorbed from American and South Vietnamese forces for years without operational breakdown, but from the presence of an enemy they could not locate through any established detection method, could not anticipate through any analysis of movement patterns, and could not neutralize through any tactical response available to them. There are documented accounts of soldiers requesting reassignment away from Phuoc Tuy Province, experienced fighters who had held their cohesion and their discipline under strategic bombing campaigns, under massed artillery, under the full industrial weight of American conventional military power applied at maximum intensity, were developing psychological incapacity specifically associated with the possibility of encountering half a dozen Australians somewhere in the jungle around them. The fear was not of superior firepower. It was of an enemy that had ceased to behave like an enemy and had started to behave like the environment itself, present everywhere and visible nowhere, capable of action at any moment, and identifiable by no method the Viet Cong possessed. By January of 1967, General Westmoreland had formed a settled assessment of what he was observing in Phuoc Tuy Province, and the assessment was not favorable to the Australians. He visited the 1 ATF base at Nui Dat, reviewed the patrol logs and contact statistics, studied the operational maps showing the distribution of small patrols across the province, and the systematic pattern of bunker system destructions that represented years of methodical work, and delivered his conclusion through Major General Tim Vincent, who commanded all Australian forces in Vietnam. 1 ATF was not being aggressive enough. The thousands of small patrols, the ambushes, the progressive dismantling of enemy food supply infrastructure that was slowly and measurably strangling enemy operational capacity. None of it registered as meaningful military activity by the standards of a doctrine whose primary measurement was enemy soldiers killed, and whose secondary measurement was territory. Swept by large formations generating contact and demonstrating the willingness to take and hold ground. The characterization of Australian operations that circulated through American staff officers at the Corps headquarters in Bien Hoa was less constrained in its language than Westmoreland's official assessment. The Australians, it was said, with the casual certainty of people who did not fully understand what they were observing, were pussyfooting. They were avoiding contact with the enemy. One ATF battalion commanders found this assessment so disconnected from the operational reality they were living that the contempt for the body count metric that it implied had, at Nui Dat, become something close to a point of professional identity. They measured progress in lines of communication severed, food caches destroyed, enemy movement interdicted, patterns of enemy behavior changing in response to sustained patrol pressure, categories that appeared nowhere on American reporting forms and produced no numbers suitable for congressional briefings. The historian Albert Palazzo would later write that when the Australians entered Vietnam, they brought a well-considered concept of war that was often contradictory or in conflict with American doctrine. This is an academic formulation for a collision between two incompatible theories of what military force exists to accomplish, conducted within an alliance where one partner was providing 500,000 soldiers and the other was providing 8,000, and where the partner, with 500,000, was entirely certain it understood the conflict better than the partner whose doctrine had been specifically designed for exactly this kind of fight. The pressure from American command was real, sustained, and eventually produced the consequence that Australian doctrine had specifically been designed to prevent. In a week in February of 1967, that validated every caution built into the Australian approach at a cost measured in Australian lives. Under the sustained weight of American insistence on demonstrating a more aggressive operational posture, one ATF committed formations to an operation in Binh Duong Province that exceeded the scale its doctrine supported for dense jungle operations. The result was the worst single week in one ATF's entire history in Vietnam. 16 killed and 55 wounded in 7 days, the majority of them during Operation Bribey. Armored personnel carriers that should have been committed to the battle from its beginning had been withheld on the assessment that dense undergrowth made the operational area unsuitable for vehicles. That assessment was wrong, and the cost of its error was paid in the time between when the assessment was recognized as wrong and when the carriers finally pushed through vegetation to extract the wounded. A Viet Cong gunner, in the confusion of the withdrawal, put a 75mm recoilless rifle round through the open cargo hatch of a personnel carrier. Operation Bribey validated, at the price of 61 Australian casualties, every single principle of caution that had been built into the Australian approach to operations in dense jungle. It validated those principles in the only language that military institutions cannot argue with. Before Bribey, before Westmoreland's critical visit, 5 months before either event, one ATF had already provided what should have been the definitive proof of what its doctrine achieved when tested at the absolute limit of human endurance. On the 18th of August 1966, Brigadier Jackson sent D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, east from Nui Dat, through the Long Tan rubber plantation to locate the mortar positions from which the base had been bombarded the previous night. 108 men walked into that plantation, accompanied by 3 New Zealand forward artillery observers from the 161st Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, whose presence would prove to be the single factor that determined whether D Company survived the afternoon. What waited inside the plantation was the full combat strength of the Viet Cong 5th Division, approximately 2,000 soldiers of the 275th Viet Cong Regiment, the D-445 Battalion, and attached North Vietnamese Army regulars, positioned and patient and entirely aware that the Australians were coming. D Company walked directly into the center of this force without knowing it existed. The first contact came in mid-afternoon, and within minutes, the company had established a defensive perimeter in the mud between the rubber trees, receiving fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The monsoon rain that had been building throughout the day broke at this moment, with the complete commitment of a tropical storm arriving over a battlefield. Rain heavy enough to turn the plantation floor to deep mud within minutes. Rain that saturated radio equipment and reduced the reliability of communications to a level that commanders on both sides could not plan around. Rain that compressed visibility to the distance between the nearest rubber trees on either side of a man's position. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend, commanding from the battalion headquarters at Nui Dat, requested immediate helicopter resupply of ammunition as the scale of the contact became clear. The helicopters were grounded. The weather made flight impossible. What the 108 men of D Company carried in their pouches and on their bodies was the sum total of what they had available to them, and it was declining with every exchange of fire. The artillery was not grounded by weather. The 161st Battery's 6 howitzers, firing from registered positions at Nui Dat, opened in support within the first minutes of the contact, and fired continuously, without pause, for 3.5 hours. Captain Maury Stanley and the 2 other New Zealand forward observers with D Company adjusted fire in gathering darkness and driving rain, calling the impact point of each successive salvo closer to their own position as enemy assault waves pushed harder against the perimeter. They called fire to margins that doctrine classified as hazardous, and that survival in this specific situation made unavoidable regardless of the classification. The guns fired above the sustained rate because the officers commanding them understood in precise and unambiguous terms what would happen to D Company if the rate dropped. The barrels reached temperatures that warranted concern about mechanical integrity. The fire continued. Ammunition reached the level of single magazines. Soldiers stripped magazines from men too badly wounded to use a rifle and passed them to men who could still aim and fire. Enemy assault waves came through the rain and the rubber trees in the gray half-light of the storm, and each wave encountered the precisely aimed fire of soldiers who had been trained in a tradition that treated every round as a resource to be accounted for because the next resupply might not come. The perimeter held through the afternoon and into the darkness. At nightfall, B Company broke through the enemy encirclement with armored personnel carriers, reaching D Company at the moment it had nearly exhausted every resource it possessed. The Viet Cong withdrew into the jungle from which they had emerged. When the Australians swept the plantation at dawn, they counted 245 enemy dead, though Vietnamese military records produced after the war would claim 47 killed, a discrepancy so large that it has never been resolved by any analysis that both sides accept, and which sits at the unresolved center of how each side remembers what happened in the Long Tan rubber plantation that afternoon. 18 Australians had been killed. 24 were wounded. 5 months later, General Westmoreland visited Nui Dat and delivered his assessment that the men of 1 ATF were not being aggressive enough. The men who had called artillery fire onto their own position in darkness and rain, while outnumbered by a factor approaching 20, were not meeting the standard. The doctrine that had held 108 against 2,000 until relief could arrive had produced insufficient results by the measurement system that American command was using. The proof had been presented and examined and found wanting, because the instrument designed to measure American-style military success was incapable of registering what Australian-style military success looked like. Westmoreland would write years later in A Soldier Reports that the Australians were the most thoroughly professional foreign force serving in Vietnam, comparable to the post-Versailles German army, in which even enlisted men might have led units in a less capable force. He wrote this from the distance of retrospection. The praise and the earlier critical assessment both belong to the same record, the same man, the same soldiers. The distance between them measures something specific about what institutions can acknowledge in hindsight that they cannot afford to acknowledge in the moment. By the second half of 1969, 3 years of unrelenting patrol pressure had produced outcomes the doctrine had predicted. The enemy food network in Phuoc Tuy Province was in systemic collapse. The 274th and 275th Regiments showed in their movement patterns the specific signatures of forces operating under acute logistical stress. Contacts declined in frequency and scale. Caches, when found, were smaller than in any previous year of the campaign. The D445 Battalion was being forced out of its home province repeatedly to find food in neighboring areas, abandoning the territory it had controlled for years, because that territory could no longer sustain its fighters. An army in that condition cannot conduct the offensive operations that an insurgency requires. It can barely maintain itself as a coherent force. The Maytao Mountains in the province's east represented the last material expression of enemy confidence in the invulnerability of their position, a sanctuary in terrain so remote and so rugged that no Allied force had penetrated it since the war began. From those peaks, the Viet Cong 5th Division maintained its regional command structure and supporting infrastructure. Somewhere within them lay Hospital K-76 Alpha, the principal medical facility for all communist forces in the region, a complex capable of treating hundreds of casualties simultaneously that intelligence had confirmed existed but had never precisely located. The hospital was not simply a medical facility. It was the mechanism by which the enemy converted its casualties back into operational soldiers, and without it, every wounded man was a permanent loss rather than a temporary subtraction. The mountains were, in the enemy's operational planning, inviolable. Operation Marsden began on the 3rd of December, 1969, and concluded on the 28th. 5 full infantry companies from the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and New Zealand were committed simultaneously. All companies deployed together with mortar teams and assault pioneers. The 4th and 52nd ARVN Battalion in support. Multiple simultaneous axes of advance, moving at the pace the doctrine had always specified and always insisted upon. The pace of silence rather than the pace of visible ambition. On the 8th of December, D Company located the first major cache in a cave on the southern face of the mountains. 2,500 anti-personnel grenades, 22 anti-tank mines, 22 boxes of anti-watercraft mines, and substantial quantities of weapons, equipment, and explosives representing months of accumulated logistics effort. The following day, B Company found the first physical evidence of the hospital on the northern face. On the 11th of December, V Company located 17 large bunkers on the eastern face, each one built to accommodate up to 100 patients, identified as sections of the K-76 Alpha Complex. On the 12th, W Company attacked an enemy camp at first light, killing 1 man while the rest scattered through jungle that was no longer the sanctuary they had believed it to be for years. The mountain was not empty, but the forces that had occupied it for years were incapable of organizing the defense that the location had always implied they could mount. General Crichton Abrams, who had replaced Westmoreland as MACV commander in 1968, and who brought to that position a somewhat different willingness to assess what he was observing, called the discoveries of Operation Marsden the biggest intelligence coup of the war. The hospital's destruction converted the enemy's wounded from patients who would recover and return to the fight into permanent casualties who could not. The caches that had taken months to accumulate were eliminated in days. 4 months later, in April of 1970, Operation Townsville added a different dimension to the campaign's achievements. Australian and New Zealand platoons captured the operational signals codes and one-time cipher pads used by the Viet Cong provincial headquarters in its command communications. Every order, every position report, every intention communicated between enemy commanders became readable by Australian intelligence. The province had been won militarily. It was now penetrated intellectually. The enemy that remained had no sanctuary, no sustainable food supply, no functioning hospital system, and no secure means of communicating its intentions to its own forces. By 1971, the D4 45 Battalion could not sustain a military presence in its own province. The regiment-sized formations that had controlled Phuoc Tuy in 1966 existed as shadows of their previous capacity. Enemy-initiated contacts had collapsed across the province. The mining campaign that had killed Australian soldiers throughout the years of operations had become sporadic and largely ineffective. Phuoc Tuy Province was secured by any measurement that did not require a body count to demonstrate the fact, and by several that did. The Australian withdrawal began in November of 1970. By December of 1971, the last combat elements of 1 ATF had departed the province. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, which had arrived in 1962 as 30 men under Ted Sarong, remained until December of 1972, first in country and last out, as the record requires to be stated. 521 Australians had been killed in Vietnam. More than 3,000 had been wounded. The province they left was secured by its own military reality. What it was not was permanently secured, because permanent security required the transfer of the patrol methodology to South Vietnamese forces, capable of sustaining it without the Australians present, and that transfer had never been fully accomplished. The continuous presence, the continuous patrol pressure, the continuous interdiction of enemy logistics that had made the doctrine work, all of it required the specific, accumulated, deeply practiced skill that Canungra had been building since 1955. In April of 1975, Phuoc Tuy Province fell with the rest of South Vietnam. The military success that 5 years of grinding, patient, invisible campaigning had produced was overturned by a political and strategic failure that had nothing to do with what happened in Phuoc Tuy and everything to do with what the broader war had never managed to become. The American military's response to what had been demonstrated across 5 years in one province was institutional silence, and the silence was deliberate rather than inadvertent. No formal doctrinal review was commissioned. No study of the patrol methodology or the food supply interdiction strategy was ordered. No integration of what 1 ATF had proven into American counterinsurgency thinking was undertaken in any form that left a traceable record. The officers who had called Australian operations evasive wrote their memoirs and received new assignments, acknowledging formally that 8,000 Australians operating with patience and silence had achieved in one province what 500,000 Americans with unlimited firepower could not achieve anywhere in Vietnam, was a conclusion that carried with it an accounting the institution was not prepared to perform. The lives that different doctrine would have saved, the years of the war that might have ended earlier, the cost of the institutional pride that had called patient patrolling cowardice, while men died executing a strategy that the Secretary of State had admitted in 1962, was built on acknowledged ignorance. The academic world was not constrained by institutional reputation. The Cambridge University Press study published in 2015, written by Andrew Ross, Bob Hall, and Amy Griffin, applied statistical and operational analysis to more than 4,001 ATF combat events and produced a mathematical account of what had happened in Phuoc Tuy that does not require doctrinal sympathy to accept. 80% first fire initiative across all contact types. 10-to-1 casualty ratios when Australian patrols fired first. A precisely documented timeline of enemy food supply collapse measured against patrol density and cache destruction rates. The numbers describe what happened with the impersonal accuracy of data, and they do not accommodate institutional pride. In 1977, Colonel Charles Beckwith was tasked with creating a unit that had no precedent in American military history. He needed a model for soldiers who could operate in small teams in hostile territory without conventional support, with exceptional individual capability and absolute fire discipline. Beckwith had served with the British Special Air Service. He had seen what small, skilled, patient teams could accomplish. And in the classified archives of a war the American military was trying to stop thinking about, he found in the operational records of 1 ATF and the SASR the detailed documentation of everything his new unit needed to embody. The methodology became the foundation of 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, known to the world as Delta Force. It arrived without Australian attribution, as training standards and selection criteria and operational philosophy, as the structure of an institution rather than the credited wisdom of another nation's hard experience. The patience, the silence, the fire superiority through concealment, the deep small unit reconnaissance, all of it was Ted Sarong's curriculum at Canungra in 1955, derived from Harold Briggs's conclusions in Malaya in 1950, proven at the cost of 521 Australian lives in a province most Americans cannot locate on a map. The official doctrinal vindication arrived in 2006, when Generals David Petraeus and James Mattis published United States Army Field Manual 3-24 on counterinsurgency. The manual's foundational principles, separating the insurgent from the population, prioritizing intelligence over firepower, understanding that sustained presence achieves what decisive engagements cannot, were the Briggs Plan of 1950 expressed in American uniform, published half a century after they had first been proven in Malayan jungle and confirmed in the rubber plantations and mountain ranges of Phuoc Tuy Province. What had been called pussyfooting in 1967 was now called doctrine. What had been called avoidance was codified as fire superiority through concealment and patience. The language was changed by institutions that needed to own the lesson before they could teach it. The lesson was not new, and it was not American, and the men who first proved it in Vietnam wore a different flag on their shoulders, and a name that the history books have spent 50 years trying to decide how much space to give. Today, when Special Operations Forces move through hostile territory in small teams, with noise discipline and minimal equipment, initiating contact on their own terms, and achieving the first burst of fire in the overwhelming majority of engagements, they are operating on a methodology whose most complete and rigorously documented proof of concept exists in the records of a province that most histories of the Vietnam War describe in a paragraph, if they describe it at all. The regiment that earned the name Ma Rung still deploys. Its soldiers move with the silence that 2 generations of institutional knowledge have made second nature. The operations change, the philosophy does not. There is a temptation, at the end of a story like this, to reduce it to a simple argument between the patient and the reckless, the learned and the merely powerful. That reading misses what the story is actually about. The American military in Vietnam contained individuals of genuine courage and real capability, who fought with everything they had in conditions that demanded everything. What the institution contained in excess was a single assumption that had hardened into something unreachable by evidence: that enough force, correctly applied, solves any problem. This assumption does not belong only to the American military of the 1960s. It appears in every institution that has ever confused the scale of its resources with the soundness of its method, that has ever assumed the approach that worked in the last situation must be correct in this one, that has ever heard a more effective answer and responded by calling the source insufficiently aggressive. The Australians who patrolled Phuoc Tuy Province were not working from a secret. They were working from a different question: not how do we destroy the enemy, but how do we understand this environment so completely that the enemy becomes irrelevant within it. Not how do we apply more force, but how do we apply the right kind of force at the right moment in the right place, with the patience to wait for that moment, rather than creating noise and movement and casualties in its absence. That question had been asked in Malaya and answered in Autumn, and proven in a dozen jungle campaigns that the American strategic apparatus had examined and set aside in favor of the doctrine it had already decided to use. The answer was always available. The cost of ignoring it was always predictable, and the men who paid that cost were not the men who made the decision to ignore it. Long Tan Day falls every 18th of August. In Australia, it marks Vietnam Veterans Day, a commemoration that most of the world does not know exists, for a contribution to a war that most of the world believes it fully understands, without reference to what happened in Phuoc Tuy Province between 1966 and 1971. The rubber plantation has grown back. The Maytao Mountains keep their silence. 521 names are on memorials that the people walking past them could often not place on a map. What was called cowardice in 1967 is called counterinsurgency doctrine today. What was called avoidance is taught as fire superiority through patience in every serious special operations curriculum in the Alliance. The names were changed by institutions that needed to own the lesson before they could transmit it. The lesson was always the same, and it was never secret. And the only thing that kept it from saving the war in which it was proven was the institutional pride of the Army that most needed to hear it and was least willing to listen. Now you know. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the 1st Australian Task Force before today? And if you knew someone who served in Vietnam, from any country at all, I want to hear their story below. The ones the history books pass over are almost always the ones that matter most.